I'd like for us to begin tonight's message by turning to Matthew chapter number 6. We're going to have a relatively simple outline. I did not finish everything last time, and so I didn't expand the outline, but we are going to expand the thoughts today. We're in a message that I've entitled, Isaac, the Seed Continues, and it's in Genesis chapter 25, but we're going to reach a point tonight where Esau is going to despise his birthright. But before we look at that particular text, I'd like to look at some other texts and deal with this issue of how we value things and what happens when our value system is skewed. It is my opinion that we have far too much quote-unquote reality TV today. Much of what is defined as reality TV is far from reality. But nonetheless, it's at least assumed that name, and we have gotten all sorts of reality television shows, and it seems with each passing year that many more continue. Some of them, however, seem to stick out in my mind. Some of them perhaps you've seen, some of them you may enjoy, some of them you maybe can't stand. Have you ever seen the show called Hoarding Buried Alive? Okay, if you haven't, that's at least worth taking a YouTube excerpt for. I wouldn't waste your time watching too much of it. But these are individuals who have acquired so much stuff that they literally struggle to live inside their own homes. In some cases, they've taken and have boxes stacked from floor all the way to ceiling. Some rooms are completely shut off because they have that much stuff stored there. In fact, in some cases, they merely have a small walkway for them to be able to get back towards the bathroom, perhaps into a kitchen, and oftentimes to something nothing more than a couch to be able to lie down on. I don't know about you, but I don't think that's any way to live. Then there are other shows that oftentimes center on antiques, such as perhaps American Pickers. Maybe you've seen that. Here are individuals, two guys go across the country. They'll go into these barns, and all of a sudden, stuff that has been sitting there collecting dust, they are very systematic in what they see. And they'll say, well, I want this, and I want that, and I want this. And they may take half a dozen items, maybe a dozen. Maybe they get a big sale, and they're able to get a whole bunch of things. It's amazing what they'll also leave, but they'll take things, and then they return them. And then there are those reality shows that center on the pawn shop idea. And these portray someone who comes into these pawn shops and they think they have something that is extremely valuable. The pawn shop personnel think differently oftentimes. It may be that they've been deceived into buying something that they thought was unique and one of a kind, but yet it was made in some foreign country and was just something nothing more than some sort of a phony duplicate. In other cases, they get there and find out that actually what they have has a significant value to it. Well, it leads me to question this. How do we determine value today? In fact, there are a lot of things that economists will use to determine value. One factor is its age. Some of you wish that you still had the cars you had when you were a teenager today. Who would have known that some of those cars, now admittedly, the cars I had as a teenager, they will never have value. It really doesn't matter. A four-door Dodge Colt with a four-cylinder, I'm just telling you, that's not going to have a whole lot of value. It doesn't really matter. However, the Mustang that I was looking at, oh, I wish I still had that car. I never was able to even get it, but to me, that was a sweet car. Some of you had some of those that you would look back and think, wow, we only gave back in the day $1,000 for that car. Now some of these cars that are collectibles and that are seen in car shows are worth an incredible amount of money because of their age. They're antiques. Some of you have antiques in your own home, things that have just perhaps been passed down from generation to generation. Go down to Dale's house sometime if you haven't, and you'll see all sorts of antiques, including Dale. But anyway, you'll see all of these things that are there, and these are items that have been passed down, in some cases, for a rather significant period of time. But there's some other factors. Scarcity is another one. We would look at if we were going out to eat perhaps tonight after the service and say, okay, well, let's go to a burger joint and we'll just get there. And we happen to pick one where the cheapest hamburger is $10. Exactly. The thoughts are, there's no way that I'm going to pay $10 for a cheeseburger. What if you hadn't eaten in a week? What if, some of you would still struggle, some of you think you would struggle. The scale might say differently, however, okay? I can stand up here and say, oh no, I'd never do that. Yeah, well, you can look at me and say, yeah, he probably would go ahead and spend the $10, okay? Well, let's just say we would never do that. A person, for example, maybe traveling for a great deal of time, was unable to acquire any kind of food whatsoever. And someone offered him this cheeseburger. I dare say in most cases he'd buy it. Many of you who are very piously saying we would never buy a $10 cheeseburger have gone to amusement parks such as Carowinds, or to an athletic game, maybe a Braves game or something like that. If you only paid $10 for a cheeseburger, you got a deal. In fact, you probably got a burger with no cheese, because cheese in the amusement park's about $2, okay? You reach the point, however, even in those situations where the scarcity of food and the hunger drives you to say, okay, this now has a much higher value than it normally would. Some struggle to go to McDonald's today because they remember what McDonald's charged 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Well, back in the day, I used to be able to buy a cheeseburger for 5 cents. Well, you can't today. I'm not sure if you ever could for 5 cents, but some of you are saying yes. Yeah, you can? Okay, all right. Well, that's a disappointing thing. No, never in my lifetime. I can go back and I can remember gasoline. I can go back into the 50s and 60 cents. Okay, that's as far back as I'm going to be able to go. Now, do you remember a few years ago when gasoline was over $4 a gallon here? What did we do? Paid $4 a gallon. Okay? We fussed the whole time. We complained. Maybe we eliminated some unnecessary trips. We attempted to buy fuel-efficient vehicles, but we still paid it when it was all said and done. Other things that determine value. This is those of you who do yard selling understand what we say when someone has sentimental value. Well, this came from my grandma. And my grandma was the only one who loved me in my entire family. And my grandma gave me this specifically. So I'm selling you this coloring book for $100. And you look at that and say, it's not worth $1. But it is to me because of sentimental value. No economist is going to suggest that really sentimental value is even a fair value to weigh something by, but nonetheless it still is something that people use to try to determine something. Some of you would not sell anything or would not sell certain things just because they have a certain value to you. For me, anything I have is for sale. Name the price. And you say, well, not your own family. I said anything I have for sale. I'm teasing, okay? I'm not sure where I'll be spending the night tonight, but it probably will not be at home. Nonetheless, you look at it and say, would I take X number of dollars for my house? Well, if it's more than I think it's worth, I probably would. Someone comes along and says, well, I'm going to give you $500,000 for your house. We're going to go house hunting. Okay? Sold is what we say, okay? Now, if somebody comes along and says, I'm going to give you $500 for your house, I'm going to say, well, you probably have an accurate assessment of its value, but I need it, okay? And so we're not going to sell it in that concept. The concept is that of value, and how do we attribute it? Value, ultimately, is only going to be whatever someone else is willing to pay for it. You ever sold a used vehicle? You always mark it up high and say, okay, well, I'm going to sell this vehicle for $2,800. And somebody comes along and says, hey, I'll give you $1,700 for it. What? That thing's worth at least $1,800, okay, and you're trying to get whatever you can out of it. The reality is if someone's going to give you only $1,700 for it and that's it, how much is it really worth? $1,700, because that's all someone's willing to pay for it. It doesn't matter what you think it's worth. The value is going to be in what someone is willing to pay for it. And that leads me to a point that suggests this: perceived worth is not always accurate. Perceived worth is not always accurate. Sometimes we have a much higher assessment of things. We feel that such and such is worth this. We feel that if we are able to do this, then we're able to get this. And our perceived value or our perceived worth is not something that is always correct. In fact, sometimes it's incorrect. I want you to notice in Matthew chapter number 6 what Jesus instructs here. Familiar passage to us all, but I want us to note verse number 19. Here Jesus is in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. The purpose of the Sermon on the Mount is to establish the demands that Jesus has. And it's clear that no unsaved person is capable of fulfilling these demands. The religious leaders of Jesus' day would be faced with the demands of Matthew 5, 6, and 7 and would have to come to the conclusion, I can't do that. If you don't understand why I say that, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 48, be therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. The whole purpose of this is to show we cannot achieve this. But at the same point in time, there are many principles in there that are able to be applied to us today. So in Matthew chapter number 6, notice verse number 19. Jesus says, lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. Now, the implication of this particular command is that this was something that was already going on and needs to stop. Stop trying to store up treasures, almost a little bit of a play on words. Something that you value. Stop amassing a wealth that is characterized by an earthly realm. In our culture today, particularly in America, we are an extremely materialistic culture. In fact, as you look across the board at various athletes, what you'll discover is that many people are repulsed by professional sports just simply because of the amount of money that people are making for their profession. If you watched the Carolina Panthers game today, you were perhaps disappointed in our extra kicking abilities, okay? As we miss those things. I told my wife, if this whole school bus thing fails, maybe I'll try out to be a place kicker for the Carolina Panthers. I wouldn't do any worse than 0 for 3. And so, hey, what happens? Maybe you're going to go ahead and make it, okay? Sometimes these athletes say, well, you know what? I am going to hold out, and I'm not going to play until you agree to pay me more money. I cannot stand that mentality. I wish as soon as someone did that, or as soon as a group said, we're going on strike because we're only getting $25 an hour, I so wish that a CEO would say, such and such is now hiring at $25 an hour. I know all the labor unions and all that stuff can't happen, but I think it would be so comical. You don't want to play? Fine, don't play. Okay? Sometimes they hold out and they win. There are other cases where they attempted to hold out and they discovered a hard reality. Nobody is going to pay them what they think they're worth. What a crucial lesson to learn. Now, I wouldn't mind learning that on several $1 million a year, okay? Oh, I'm sorry, I only have to live on $6 million as opposed to $8 million a year. But some individuals learn this lesson. The issue is that it says, stop laying up for yourselves these kinds of treasures that are characterized by anything but permanence. They are temporary in every aspect. He describes them as moth and rust are going to corrupt these things. These things are going to deteriorate. What doesn't deteriorate is subject to being stolen. There is no long-term value on that which is earthly. Instead, Jesus says, lay up and continuously lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Live with a different value system, a mindset that is going to embrace that which is eternal. Here, these are things where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. These have long-term value, but the problem is they're not going to be perceived as having immediate value. And that's the problem that far too many of us run into. We want something, and we want it now. We are an instant-driven society. Our phones cannot access the data fast enough. Our microwaves cannot heat the meal up quickly enough. Our children do not obey soon enough. Okay? We need instant everything. And we often want an instant gratification. Give me this pleasure now. Why? Because I think I deserve it. Do you see where the problem is? The whole system is skewed. Instead, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And then Jesus makes what I think is a very telling statement. He says in verse 21, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. What you value indicates something about your spiritual life. What we'll learn, and we'll see illustrated tonight, is that our value system, what we believe to be valuable, shapes our priorities. Those, in turn, form the basis of our decisions. Our value system shapes our priorities, and those, in turn, become the basis of our decisions. Let's turn to another book. We don't study it often, the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter number 2. The book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 2, I am one who believes that this is Solomon who is spoken of. There are some commentators who might disagree with that, but I think that we're speaking of Solomon here in the book of Ecclesiastes. It is interesting, and as you interpret this book, that you have to understand that this is a book that describes a life apart from God. This is not suggesting that these are good things to do, but it does record an individual's search for meaning in life apart from God. Incidentally, he never found it. What he found is a phrase that is repeated often throughout Ecclesiastes. All is vanity, and in some cases, vexation of spirit. There is nothing of any value. Now, if we took that mindset and didn't understand that he's interpreting this in a framework of a life apart from God, we would draw some improper conclusions. But I want you to notice the pursuit that he gave himself to trying to obtain immediate pleasure and immediate satisfaction. Notice in Ecclesiastes 2, verse number 1. I said in mine heart, go to now, I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore, enjoy pleasure. And behold, this also is vanity. Do whatever makes you happy, and you'll be happy. You know what he learned? That's vanity. That's empty. Have you ever gone down that path that says, you know what, do whatever is going to make you happy? For the Christian, 9 times out of 10, unless you're spiritually minded, 9 times out of 10, that's going to lead to a tremendous amount of sorrow. I said of laughter, verse 2, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth? What's the point of joy, of laughter? I sought in mine heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting mine heart with wisdom, and to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was that good for the sons of men, which they should do under the heaven all the days of their life. So I'm going to give myself to a pursuit to try to determine what is it that man is supposed to do while on this earth. Notice what he did. I made me great works. I planted me houses, or I built me houses. I planted me vineyards. I made me gardens and orchards. I planted trees in them of all kinds of fruits. I made me pools of water to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. I got me servants and maidens, had servants born in my house. Also I had great possessions of great and small cattle, above all that were in Jerusalem before me. It sounds like he's gotten quite a fortune. A lot of material possessions. I gathered to me also silver and gold and the peculiar treasure of kings and of the provinces. I got me men singers, women singers, the delights of the sons of men as musical instruments, and that of all sorts. I've got material possessions. I've gotten the musical things that are going to elevate me in the eyes of society. So I was great, verse 9, and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. You think about that. Can you imagine being in a financial position that if you wanted it, all you had to do was buy it? Drive down the road, see a brand new truck, I want that, I'm going to go buy it. Okay, I guess there are people who live that way, but I don't think that's our scale in here. Whatever I want, he says, I'm going to buy it. I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of all my labor. I would suggest in the first 10 verses that there was an immediate pleasure. Okay? However, that was very short-lived. Verse 11. Then I looked on all, let's turn too many pages, hang on, all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do. And behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. I looked on everything that I had acquired, and lo and behold, there was no value to it. Many Christians live for themselves. They have invested in all sorts of perhaps financial areas, and they've profited financially. They've been successful in the world's eyes. But when they get back to the end of their life, or when they step back away from it to the point where they can objectively evaluate it, what they will conclude is, I have lived for nothing. I have put all of this effort and all of this time and all of this energy into something that does not satisfy. That is a tragic description of far too many Christians today. They can achieve promotions. They can achieve good jobs. They can have a career that might take them wherever they want to go, economically, even perhaps geographically. But what they will discover, if they are not pursuing God first, all of those things will amount to nothing. In fact, some of the wealthiest people ever known have also personally attested to their own misery. Among them would include men such as Rockefeller, a man who possessed tremendous amounts of money, yet personally attested to his own misery. It is my opinion that we place too much value on the temporary, and we place too little value on the eternal. We want all of this now. I'll take it a step further and suggest that a glimpse of one's own mortality often influences priorities. Have you ever come to perhaps a near-death experience in your life? Maybe you were told something that, if is true, may result in your death. I'll never forget being told when I'm supposed to have my appendix taken out, you've got a mass in your pancreas. Well, that's really encouraging. Thank you. I could have done without that. You know, for me, that was a moment right there that said, wow, life is awfully short. And if this is what I think it's going to be, life is going to be much shorter than I anticipated. Some of you have personally testified to the life that you lived before you were saved. And it's an amazing thing that you're still alive today. Those kinds of things, maybe a car accident, an experience that says, I could have died there, often reshapes priorities. Often things get put into a much bigger perspective. Lying in a room, in an emergency room with a doctor who says you have a mass in your pancreas, it really didn't matter what my annual income was at that point in time. Thoughts immediately go to, wow, my hope was to see my daughters graduate high school and see them walk down an aisle and be married. That was my plan. And all of a sudden, reality hits. That may not be God's plan. It's an amazing thing. I soon found myself enrolled in graduate school. Stupid pancreas. Okay. No. But all of a sudden, priorities tend to change. The focus tends to say, you know what? I have to live for eternity. Who knows how long we're going to live? Some of the younger ones, we would tend to say in this room, they're not through halfway their life. But none of us in here knows today may very well be the very last day we have. That's a reality that often does not govern how we think. But when we understand this, it tends to shape our priorities into what it is that truly matters. Do we want the immediate pleasure, or do we want the long term? Far too often, the immediate pleasure prevails over the long term. Give it to me now. You've seen the financial commercials, I'm sure. It's my money, and I want it now. Call J.G. Wentworth. Okay. 1-877 cash now. I've heard way too many television things, okay? I said, why do you hear all that? Because of what used to be going on behind me in the motor coach, okay? J.G. Wentworth is all the time on ESPN, okay? We'll give you all of this now. Let me ask you, at what cost? 30% interest? 25% interest? They're not going to give you everything at their expense. I can tell you that much. Gambling is a really good idea. The odds are definitely in your favor. That's why casinos are generally really run down. Okay? But people will continue to pile this in because they might get just a little bit more. Have you gone to a fair recently and seen one of those things that pushes the coins out? You know, all you got to do is drop in another quarter and you're about to get $10 worth of quarters, except those things stay on there for forever. Okay? At least long enough for the fair people to take it down and get all the money. But the idea, well, I got it this time. Oh, I got it this time. Oh, no, this time. This time for sure. If these things were losing money and the odds were in your favor, they would not be in existence. But yet we want the immediate. And it often governs our minds to such a degree that we avoid all common sense. Let's see this illustrated quickly in Genesis 25. Don't worry, this is just the body of the message that we're getting to. Genesis chapter number 25. It's really not that long, I promise. Genesis 25, and what we come across is an extremely sad account of a man whose value system was extremely skewed. And he does something that he ends up greatly regretting later on. Let's begin. We've already seen in our study in Genesis 25 in this section, a seed continued and a contrast described. I want us to see this third point, a birthright despised. Notice verse 29. We'll read through the text. Jacob, the Bible says, sod pottage, and Esau came from the field and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. And Jacob said, Sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, Behold, I am at the point to die. What profit shall this birthright do to me? Jacob said, Swear to me this day. And he sware unto him. And he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. And we'll go look at another passage here in just a little while, but if you read that passage, you might just tend to think, well, it didn't work out so bad. Just kind of like a meal exchange program like they have at college. You give me this, and I'll get to eat. And it's a whole lot bigger than that. Well, number one, let's notice a birthright coveted in the first verses 29 through 31. Jacob, who is, as we've already seen last week, the individual who would be more civilized, the individual who would dwell more inside of the tent. Esau is the hunter. Esau is the outdoorsman. Isaac loves Esau. Jacob loves Rebekah. All sorts of problems are starting to brew with all of this. Children are unique, there's no doubt about that, but we cannot be guilty of showing favoritism, as we noted last time. But here is Jacob, who the Bible says sod pottage. In other words, he was cooking a dish of lentils, let's just say a bean-like vegetable. And when Esau returned from hunting, the Bible says that he was faint. In other words, he was famished. He was what teenagers would say, starving to death. And it's only been 2 hours since they ate. But they're starving to death. This is Esau. He was faint. He was exhausted. Incidentally, that's not a very good time to make major decisions. You're not thinking rationally. Well, Jacob capitalized on Esau's physical desire. Esau said to Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, those red lentils, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. Edom means red. It seems as though, whether he got this because he was red and hairy all over, as we saw to be red. And so Jacob now says, okay, Esau says, give me what you're cooking. I'm hungry. I need to eat. I'm at the point of exhaustion. Jacob, give me this. And Jacob said, Sell me this day thy birthright. I've heard a lot of preachers say that Jacob deceived Esau into selling his birthright. Jacob is a deceptive person, I'll admit that. But there's no deception here. I'll give you this if you sell me your birthright. He was quite straightforward with the terms of the agreement. Now, to us, a birthright's like, well, really, what's the big deal about a birthright? That leads us to a second point, a value system skewed. What's the big deal about a birthright? Well, the birthright would suggest, number one, that an individual would receive twice the inheritance of whatever they had. So Esau would receive a double portion from what anyone else would have in the family. There was a material benefit that was there. There was an authoritative position that would often come because this person would, once the father passed, now be put in charge of the family or in charge of the clan. He was now the newly appointed leader whenever the father died. More importantly, there was a spiritual blessing. There was the blessing that this would put him in a closer relationship with God. A birthright was a big deal. And Jacob wanted it. Sell me this day thy birthright. I want you to notice how Esau reasoned. I'm at the point to die. Do you really think he's that famished? I doubt it. I guess his hunt must not have been too good. Wouldn't logic assume that if he's this much of an outdoorsman, and of course we know Isaac loves his meat, that he gets, hey, go out and be a man and kill your own food. Obviously hunting didn't go well. And he said, I'm at the point to die. What profit shall this birthright do to me? Here's what he says. That birthright has no value to me. In fact, he actually reasoned that a bowl of vegetables was of greater value than this. Obviously, we have to develop a value system that is honoring to the Lord. When your value system is carnal, the decisions that you make based on that value system are going to be carnal. This is how he perceived things. Carnal decisions inevitably overemphasize the temporary. They will do so to either the detriment or even to the exclusion of the eternal. All the time. Jacob said, swear to me. Well, in fact, let me just lead on to point number 3, a decision regretted. Jacob said, swear to me this day. Jacob knew that Esau might come back on this. I want you to make a vow. Now, Esau should have said, I wonder why he's so intent on this. Maybe this is a decision I'm going to regret, but he never once reasons through this. And he sold his birthright unto Jacob. So then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils. Was the bread an extra bonus? I don't know. The original bargaining was only for a bowl of soup. I'll throw in the bread absolutely free. But I want you to notice the callousness with which Genesis 25 ends. He, meaning Esau, did eat and drink and rose up and went his way. Doesn't it sound as though he was unaffected by this decision? At least temporarily. Thus did he despise his birthright. This was the manner in which he treated his birthright to be of little value. Now I want you to turn in closing to Hebrews chapter number 12. Hebrews chapter number 12. And I want you to notice, we'll pick up the reading for the context's sake in verse number 14. But I want you to see how the writer of Hebrews points to the effects of this decision a little bit later on. Verse 14 of Hebrews 12. The author of Hebrews says, follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. Looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. Lest there be any fornicator, or, notice, profane person, as Esau. Now notice how he puts this into a description. Who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. He sacrificed the long term for the immediate. For ye know, verse 17, how that afterward, years later, when he would have inherited the blessing, do you remember how that takes place in the deception later on in Genesis? That's the point when this becomes a reality to him. He was rejected, for he found no place of repentance, though he sought it carefully with tears. The decision was irreversible. You know, oftentimes we make decisions constantly throughout the day. Our decisions reflect our value system. Our value system inevitably will shape our priorities. And those priorities will become the basis of our decisions. Let's let it not be said of us when we get to the end of our life that we look back at a life and shed tears over what could have been. What a challenge. All of us in here have made decisions that we wish we hadn't made. We wish we could go back in time and redo some decisions. We all know in here we can't. But what we can do as I've said many times from this pulpit, make sure the next step you take is the right step. Don't continue down that same path. Get a value system that's in accordance with what God values. And what you'll discover is eternal reward. That's how we should be functioning.